This year, which is about trying to work with you on these ideas of affinity groups, is a way of saying how you should recognize the context of ideas outside of your own kind of limited scope in a way. Or it's also a way of saying, in architecture school, as opposed to just in general life, ideas and migrate around places, time frames, and through certain kinds of media, and they coalesce around certain, let's say, clusters and organizations of people, which is why I was kind of talking about people who produce ideas as well as just generally what ideas are. And maybe the curiosity today is in the age of access, where paradigmatic ideas are less and less the product of a single person. Then we understand that there's then multiple people and multiple ideas involved. So this is a talk also that, I mean, it could go on for hours, at some level in terms of trying to break down some of these ideas. So what I've done is I've taken some historical, shall we say, 20th century things that I know that are going to give you a little bit more of a background on, I think, this school and also the trajectory of some things that I've been working on, although I'm not really showing my own work. But what I want you to do is you could insert any contemporary phenomena into any of this that I'm going to talk about, and in essence you should, because I can't analyze necessarily all the contemporary youth culture sets of ideas and affinities and so forth. So I'm going to explain what I think groups are, bubbles are, and alignments, and there's different relationships obviously in each one. And Tom, I don't know if you've used the word tribe more often than, let's say, when we were talking about it in the group, but it's it's an understood term, especially in the sense that tribes have all kinds of characteristics that define them. So, okay. First kind of group I want to talk about is a uniform group, and there's a lot of obvious references about uniform and what uniform means, which is like-mindedness, like begets like, adhering to certain ideologies and so forth. So for the young people, there was a group called the Beatles, and they were part of what was called the British invasion of bands. This is from 1960, and the Beatles were playing a music called ska, or skiffle music, and it was coming out of the 1950s. Electric guitars were just happening, but the main thing was the 1950s image of the rebel and the outlaw, which was well known in contemporary American culture. People like James Dean and Marlon Brando and so forth. So if you wanted to present yourself as a rock and roll band that was going to be potentially seen as being radical or new or dangerous, then you had to take this particular kind of gear and portray yourself in a certain way, even though the music was a particularly kind of folk-oriented kind of music on the one hand. So this is how they started. They're a group. There's hierarchies in the group, but this is a group where they all said, we're going to agree to look like this, and we're going to agree to put everything together and make something very, very specific as a group, and we're different than a team. And I'll describe what a team is versus a group. So a few years later, they swap out the leather gear for the for the suit, and the suit's got specific fashion elements to it, no collar and kind of piping and trimming and so forth, fully buttoned up. ties, and the hair is slightly longer but still respectable at some level, and they're all smiling and fresh-faced and so forth. So in a way, between the dour looks and the kind of motorcycle gear, they translate to essentially, the idea of a global pop group phenomenon. Now, haircuts and shoes and clothes and things like that are just one of the easiest ways to talk about what does it mean to be in a tribe, because for many, many, many tribes, even tribes or groups that make a media like music, obviously in terms of music, it's very, very important in terms of what you look like. But the idea of the uniform appearance where the individual is pushed back, obviously, into the self-similarity of the suit, there are formal aspects to this, which is total repetition. Everybody becomes essentially a kind of company man within the group. Same project, different time frame, only 3 years later, and that tells you how fast things are moving between this kind of monochromatic British post-war world to the fact that drugs are happening and the psychedelia of the world is happening, and Britain did not sponsor, the kind of first world set of concerns and issues of youth culture, globally kind of sponsored, this idea. And so color and fashion design start to come into play with vague forms of military organization, vague forms of band uniform, and the blend between the band uniform, the military uniform, and all of the regalia and so forth with the yellow background. Now the mustaches are out, the hair is a little bit longer, and we're sending messages, but we're still incredibly uniform in terms of our work and our ideology. Now, at that time, the Beatles did go to India and started playing sitars and getting into transcendental meditation and so forth. And in many respects, it was just one example of how other cultures were especially giving an aesthetic project to what otherwise had been a very straightforward kind of representation of post-war England, let's say. The Maasai tribe is along with the Zulus in Africa, probably one of the two biggest, tribes. And when you examine the term, you go straight to East or West Africa, and there's like no tribe in Africa that doesn't have obviously an incredibly long and rich history. On the one hand, especially as it's represented in how they look. Obviously, how they think, how the society works, and the uniformity of the society and so forth is all part of it. But the kind of chromatic range of things that you see here, including face painting, tattoos, incredible beaded collars and headdresses and so forth. You think about all of the kinds of messages, that are going on, obviously both local, but visually how they affect the way in which they portray themselves as being engaged in life. So a group is not a team. What's a team versus a group? So a team, like a chessboard or something like that, where there's strong hierarchies, yes, there's still a uniform idea. We're all in the same group. We're all playing for the same goal, but we all have different roles, and there's vague aspects of non-democratic, hierarchical, organizational ideas, even though the single kind of outcome is what we all, kind of look at. There's the goalkeeper who wears a different color kit so they're not confused with the outfield players. There's all kinds of rules about that. So a team versus a group, you're playing a different role, and I think that we're not working with teams, or at least I don't think so. I think we're working with groups in terms of the idea of uniformity. So back to the Beatles. This picture is about 6 months or so before they break up. They're together for about 10 years, and they make, this incredible transition in their music and so forth. So at the end, the Beatles don't have the uniform on anymore. That ended in the late 60s when the idea of the individual, which we were kind of talking about today, takes over. And in fact, when you look at this picture, this is the end. And they're breaking up for various reasons. John Lennon says, "Fuck it, I just want peace in the world, and I can't deal with the world of the commercial and people telling me what to do." And he was beginning his world for 10 years on the one hand as an activist, so he was checking out in that direction. And George Harrison just wanted spirituality. He wanted to continue what he saw and felt in the trips to the Middle East and to India in the years prior. Paul McCartney just wants to be popular. He's already dressed for it. He doesn't have a beard. His hair is pretty short. He looks pissed off. And he's going in his own direction. And Ringo is whatever. I like Ringo. So you can't be a group anymore if you don't think alike. So the group is finished. So if you're going to be in a group, then there's got to be a shared agenda, otherwise it obviously falls apart. And so they're all essentially going to go find other groups based on what their interest is. So it connects us to the idea that you need to be with like-minded people. Otherwise, your sense of autonomy is going to really kill you. The British invasion, everybody wore a suit, at least for a particular time, and they wore it during the same time that the Beatles did. And somehow, whether you took it on as a slightly vague historical device, like the Kinks, or a slightly English preppy look for the Rolling Stones. This is around 1964, 65. And the Animals, it's like the houndstooth coat, and here they have the checkered, they flipped it. Like, okay, you do that, we'll do this. Same haircuts. The Yardbirds, there's Jeff Beck. He doesn't have the tie on, which is very glaring, but otherwise. So is this what they were dealing with? 1950s corporate identity, which is, okay, somehow rock and roll, at least in the beginning, got disciplined, maybe because of the idea of the formal presentation of it. Maybe it was a curious way in which rock and roll had to take hold, and if it did, then it should be, even in the case of the British invasion, not only do we have groups, but they form a giant bubble of we're all going to look the same, so that as a project, we're all participating. So if you imagine a diagram, if I had time to do it, the Kinks bubble and the Yardbirds group circle, and there'd be the bigger one. And in each case, the other thing that ties them all together, of course, is Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters. Every one of them were working with American blues as a form to the music. This whole British invasion, people weren't saying, well, you're going to do the blues, and then we're going to do like non-linear experimentation in the guitar, or something like that. Or, only when Pink Floyd came around, but Pink Floyd were too late for the uniform culture. So at some level, this is what would even bind, groups that think that they're doing something different, of course, making them come together. Okay, so this is a pretty short talk, so not to wear out my welcome. Around the issue of technology and around the issue of media from the 60s on, there were cities and artists and architects working on certain things in which you would say very clearly there were affinities for certain ways of working and thinking. What's interesting about all of these is that they are deeply affected by the cultural condition of the time, which is, it's before the internet. There's aspects of resistance to commercial culture, critique of commercial culture, kind of radicalization of the middle class, et cetera, that we saw latent in, rock and roll. And I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 little micro kind of bubbles, I would say, of technology in a particular time frame. So from the late 60s to the 70s, there were artists and architects, actually, who liked working with TVs and cars. TV and cars representing, on the one hand, the rise of advertising and the hypnosis of TV on the one hand, and the mobility of the car at the same time. Two things, maybe even more than the suburban house itself, defined the idea of a certain kind of liberation. Now, this particular group of images runs from Germany to Vienna to San Francisco. And so I'm going to also talk about cities and lines and versus groups, because when you have people working in multiple cities on, let's say, the same affinity project, they may or may not have been hanging out together. And so hanging out together and being in a group, being in the same place, exchanging ideas is different strictly than sharing an affinity for somebody that you don't know, on a personal level on the one hand. And that's a curious thing, because I'm arguing that you should know affinities outside of people that are your friends, because the audience is much, much bigger. So this is Vostell. He's a German action artist in 1970 called Concrete Traffic. And he, in particular, was interested in his version of happenings, which, of course, is a form of action art. You can only record it a little bit. You can, it's really about the here and the now, and action had a way of talking about speed and mobility and images and so forth, and also, in many respects, in the 1960s, death and destruction, and putting death and destruction in your face in a way. So that's his piece in Spain, actually, in a museum that he actually helped organize in Spain, in this totemic piece from 1977. And Ant Farm, which was an American group from the late 60s as well, with their famous media burn a piece, this big giant tail fin Cadillac, plowing through the stack of televisions. And if you were there, you remember it. Otherwise, this image is the kind of time capsule of that project. Now, I'm not sure if Vostell and Ant Farm hung out. I don't think so. I didn't find any evidence that they did. It's not like they were unaware of one another, because at this time, galleries and enough media going on between places like the West Coast and Germany and action artists in Vienna to make that kind of connection clear. Now, here I am making these two slides appear next to one another so I can draw an association with them. And what's going on here are two things. One is there are artists and architects working with TV sets and media and cars who may have been, talking to one another, but on the final analysis, I'm putting them together at some level. So there is a kind of critical agency that one has when one's thinking about where one's work is in the field of production. June Paik's work in the Fluxus world combined TV sets and live performance, as we see here in his famous piece for the cello. And J.G. Ballard in England, although he's a bit off the axis that I'm talking about, is essentially writing novels like Crash and essentially giving all these artists and architects a kind of blueprint or inspirational novel to continue the critique of consumerism and the suburbs and sprawl and wealth, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about these artists with these formal things, they like working with TVs and cars, then they're asking the question, what am I saying, with that? For Ballard, it was about the ambivalence of the technosphere, and for the others, it was probably being younger, they were critical of consumer society. But they're working as a group, even though they're not the group in the same way that the Beatles were a group. I'm going to talk about machines in a couple of different guises, partly because it's familiar and in my own pathway and trajectory is part of this world. And so it's important for me maybe to paint a little bit of a picture of what that is. If there was a affinity group called machines, which there isn't because it's not a relevant agenda today, these agendas were relevant back in the time, then there'd be nuanced, let's say nuanced bubbles within the group or groups within the bigger bubble. And the one I'm going to outline first is the British-American axis with technology. Now, Albert Frey, this is a 1931 Illuminaire house, the first steel and aluminum building actually in the United States, or one using this kind of skin pretty extensively. He was an emigre, of course, from Switzerland by way of working for Le Corbusier, but the house was first built in New York in 1931. So there's obviously a long trajectory of what technology and machines are in architecture. I can just do hours and hours on that. But the idea of technology, on the one hand, through Eames, a project that we know here, and also begins a little bit of a relationship between the West Coast kind of innovation project on the one hand and how it would migrate. The machine, here in the garden as being something where it's pretty hardcore in terms of its directness and its anonymity on the one hand, although the very anonymity that they were seeking in the project, the off-the-shelf directness, became essentially a kind of portrait of them as industrial designers. One of Norman Foster's earliest projects was this one in London, in which case the lineage of the work of the project of Eames's off-the-shelf project, and Eames didn't really have a rhetoric of the machine. He didn't talk about the machine in the way in which we might through Herbert Marcuse in the 50s or something about how technology was going to dominate everything. Eames just sort of assumed that was a fact and didn't polemicize it. Foster also at the same time did not, and made only assumptions that the way forward, especially in the 1960s, was through technology, to the extent that technology was articulated in architecture as being industrial components deployed in a straightforward way. And again, here, in putting these images together, I was seeing this relationship between the garden and the machine, of which a classic dichotomy in the 20th century about humanism and progress, these things become incredibly emblematic of that. And I don't think Foster was hanging out with Eames all that much. He hung out with other people, primarily Fuller, who, of course, much, much older, and I won't go through the litany of all of his works, was the precursor in many ways to Eames, although the Eameses were coming as industrial designers and Fuller as an engineer. You can see the affinity that these architects have for the idea that technology itself, the image of it, the fetish of it, the sense of an agenda of make it lighter and more efficient, starts to take on, a transcontinental relationship. Foster studied at Yale when Fuller was there, also Richard Rogers. So this is the moment in which the British high-tech axis emerges really from the United States, and Fuller being a kind of axis point for these kinds of projects like the Dymaxion car and his domed bubble. So Foster's machine in the garden, while it looks Misesian on the one hand, Foster wasn't invoking Mies, who was also just the lightest touch of what technology was supposed to be about, like you build a building in steel and that's the zeitgeist, nothing more, nothing less than that. Whereas for Foster, through Eames and through Fuller, is saying something about the fetish of high tech. This talk is not about influence. It's not where things came from, even though it's all a continuum. What I'm trying to draw here is that there are affinities and there are projects that people work on, and yes, there are people who become, let's say, transitional figures between groups. So while this is a historical kind of retrospective of this particular time, you could take anything going on today, whether it's rappers or hip-hop artists or whatever, in terms of how they coalesce into various kinds of groups, bubbles, etc. James Sterling's project, also from 1969, exploring truly the machine in the garden, here with the Olivetti project of prefabricated plastic facade components. And although old-fashioned stick-built to us in 1969, that was like the highest level of glass envelope you could build in architecture. So I couldn't help but put this in, because Sterling took his machine and he had to filter it through postmodernism, and he was steadfast in the way in which certain aspects of the hardware of a project were going to still play out. This is the Fogg Museum at Harvard, where the symmetry is undeniable. And virtually at the same time in Japan, Shin Takamatsu also taking on Gundam hardware fetish with a certain kind of postmodernism filtered through Viennese turn-of-the-century architecture and so forth. Now, I put these two images together. I don't have any evidence that Jim Sterling and Shin Takamatsu hung out. They weren't in the same city. They didn't teach at the same school. And this is probably some sort of curatorial, sort of connection. But going back to how do you organize your precedents and so forth, you can actually create your own group, as I've done here, if you understand the way in which things work, as well as finding yourself within that kind of group. But technology in America in the 1960s was driven, most radically through the NASA program, where, the highest level of technology was going into building moving platforms, Saturn V rockets, all manner of infrastructure. The highest level of industrial design, is going in right here, and architecture, except for a few, sort of minor projects, couldn't really keep up with this level of acceleration. It wasn't demanded, of architecture, still building in concrete and wood and so forth. And obviously what we see in this is the spectacle of the moonshot that was really the paradigm for, let's say, Peter Cook and archigram, and also, to a certain extent, the metabolists, although I'm not talking about the metabolists, because in some respect, their relationship to kind of international culture did emerge, from the Expo 70, which you see on the right. But Peter's project from 1963, which was a proposal for Expo 67, of which Fuller built the dome at, this project got, I wouldn't say recycled, but reappropriated at some particular level, for the next Expo in Osaka in 1970. Now, archigram and the metabolists did, from time to time, I wouldn't say hang out, but from time to time, of course, they did coalesce around certain, cities and events and so forth, and also sharing publications. But of course, the project of technology, especially at the level of spectacle, which technically was not what Eames or Foster or even to a certain extent Sterling were. So the spectacularists as a subgroup of let's make the building look like a machine as much as possible to tell the story, those are people who share an affinity versus I'd like to use technology for it to be understated and efficient. That's another subset group, a little bit more uniform in both cases. There's the mediating project on the one hand between British high-tech, American Buckminster Fuller modularity, and Japanese ideas. So the spectacle of archigram on the one hand and its colorful project gets more and more psychedelic, and to the point where it's almost the same as what's going on in music and what's going on in terms of contemporary society. Although strangely enough, Peter Cook hates rock and roll, only listens to classical music, yet I couldn't find a more rock and roll image on the one hand to put out there. So the high-tech project, though, in the case of Pompidou, where Foster and Piano and Rogers, they all get a project done that is super efficient, super rigorous, and has all the tenets of what's going on previously in the Eames project, and still has the project of the spectacle built into it at the same time. So in a way, this project represents the merging of groups and discrete enthusiasms of groups relative to high-tech architecture. Which then, with people like Jan Kaplitzky, who worked for Foster, emerges and makes his own group or his own version of the project for the spectacle of high tech, returning at the most highly developed and highly rigorous kinds of levels, but bringing back the kind of scale, the mind-numbing scale projects of archigram in a way. But needless to say, in London, between 1962 and up even until the mid-'80s, Kaplitzky, Cook, Foster, they all had different kinds of offices and different ways in which they ran offices, but they all in many ways shared in the enthusiasms of the dream of technology, the dream of technology liberating us. And so the machine, of course, is the central idea that takes on many different kind of guises to a certain extent. And their project Future Systems project in 1999 kind of culminates in this rather smooth project that rejects hardware in favor of the dipped in plastic pre-Apple product idea of technology, which is they woke up and said it's not about expressing hardware, but it's about concealing and producing mystery within industrial design, which I think is also at some level, although I'm not showing Hadid's work relative to that idea of the machine morphing into the project of the smooth. Cooper, Cranbrook, and SCI-Arc machines, the cult of the private school. So we're in a private school, and there's lots of double entendres with the private school, which is, and I mean this as a kind of a cool idea, just being a part of the history of it. Private says stay out, or we'll decide who gets in. So cults and ideas about those sorts of things, I want to be provocative about that because we're engaged in the idea of identity and the production of identity. As you know, John Haydock was the dean at Cooper Union, and Libeskind was at least one of the 2 or 3 most famous graduates from the school in the early 70s. And this is a writing machine project from the mid-'80s, and we don't have to talk about Libeskind's career or anything since then. But when one investigates the idea of technology as being, let's say, filtered through Dada or filtered through deconstruction, filtered through Derrida, filtered through Diderot, et cetera, these are the kinds of machines that you would get. And this is the kind of work, in many respects, that was being done at the time, both at Cranbrook and also at Cooper Union, and it was rather particular and presided over by particular people, and in many ways it was known but also insulated at the same time. Liz Diller, graduating, I think, 6 or 7 years after Libeskind, and we don't have to talk about that career after that, and here's what they were doing in the 1980s with Duchampian space and making drawings becoming machines and extrapolating out of technology relative to the absurdity of the Duchampian machine and the Dada machine. Or at Cranbrook, Ben Nicholson, a graduate, I think, studied underneath Libeskind, making these projects about technology and machines that, on the one hand, could only have been cultivated within the conditions, I want to say, of the private. And private doesn't necessarily mean anything negative, except to say we're talking about a conversation in which the expertise of it, the protocols, the rhetoric and the vocabulary is a proprietary one, and proprietary conversations carried out in groups, thinking of just think tanks and skunk works and things like that, where the public really isn't part of the conversation. It's not an open world. Especially the axis between Cranbrook with Libeskind and Cooper, it was nearly impenetrable on the one hand, yet it was producing one of the most kind of highly coherent sets of investigations and projects, to the point where it truly did reflect the idea of a school of thought. Now, it's an interesting turn from somebody like Ben Nicholson drawing something in Cranbrook to this project, which I think is now closed, but was one of the early Morphosis projects in Beverly Hills for a restaurant in LA. And you see this diorama, kind of mural. It was a boxing image. I think there was a story and a connection about that. But Tom and Michael said, you know, we built a machine in the middle of the restaurant. They called it a machine, and what was cool about it is it didn't do anything. So extrapolating from the whole conceptual poetic of what a machine is and does, and this is coming from an office that they didn't go to Cranbrook, they didn't go to Cooper, and so you already feel like but teaching at SCI-Arc, that the forces at work between, you know, those three schools were incredibly strong, to the point where it was informing much of what Tom and Michael were doing at the time. And this is in a cancer research center in Cedars-Sinai, another machine I mean, I don't think that Tom or Michael called it a machine in the in anything but the most abstract sense, yet at the same time, the way in which it's put together, its material qualities. Here we see a TV set, again, where aspects of media and presentation, which I think in many respects were embedded in the question of media as we found in the TVs and Cars projects from that time. But these are strong affinities for the idea of, well, this version of technology in the mid-1980s, these three schools are operating kind of as a group. And I didn't ever go to Cranbrook, and I didn't ever go to Cooper because I was never invited, but I always felt like SCI-Arc was willing constantly to be the least private school of the three. So this is a drawing I did in 1991. It was a proposal for a sculpture in a I think it was in a lobby, corporate lobby in Japan, commissioned by Kuma. Didn't get built, but you can see some obvious reference points for it, just in terms of its what it looks like, and you know, the idea of metallic figures taking on almost character qualities, wire frames and solids as opposition, et cetera, imbuing technology, or imbuing the idea of a machine with particularly both rhetorical qualities and also abstract qualities. That's what I saw in the work of, let's say, what Tom and Michael were doing, and I had an affinity for what they were doing at the time. I also think that they had an affinity with what I was doing and what I brought to LA before I got here. And just a few years later, here's a, speaking of models, this is a one-to-one thing, but I remember like bending and welding this thing and, you know, really getting, for me, my hands dirty to make a project. So this continues out of the trajectory. I was teaching at SCI-Arc in both grad and undergrad while I was making these kinds of projects. So needless to say, the school had a big impact. But this kind of triangle of schools was really powerful. And pretty funny that Tom went back and built Cooper Union. Not funny, actually amazing. So speaking of that, here's just a small, very, very small segue to three architects, all of whom you know. And the idea of architects searching for something beyond beauty. And that's Wolf Prick's Carl Pimmelblau's project for the rooftop. Now, you can read up on you know, the ideas and agendas, but for me, the work of Tom Main and Moss, and Eric Moss and Wolf shared the affinity for the anxiety of beauty and the problematic of beauty, and that as a filter for, you know, judging, you know, work in a way. So the idea of trying to create an affinity not simply for these kinds of materials, forms, and so forth, but the particular way in which all of these projects deal with, and this is the Hippo Bank, deal in transgressive elements, some sort of defined limit and very clear things that are going to transgress that limit and break that limit. You could describe it with a whole series of other, kinds of terms that might be even more aggressive. But I particularly see these three architects at a particular time at SCI-Arc in the late 80s as obviously sharing, a particular agenda. And if I'm the three of them, or if I'm one of them, I'm thinking, as Christy said, how do I step aside so that they can make their version of the project and I can make my version of the project, and then I can offer progress within the group. And I'm pretty sure that's probably what was going on with these kinds of things. If only, let's say, in the case of Eric's project where he slumped glass, and I know the stories because this was built while I was the director at SCI-Arc, slumping glass in Orange County, and sheet after sheet after sheet breaking and failing and so forth, and the anxiety of dealing with material and material processes, and the kind of critical paranoid method of making work on the one hand. This is definitely my filter, but needless to say, these architects were in the same place, hanging out, having conversations, and probably doing more than agreeing on things, probably arguing quite a bit. But if you look at the quote-unquote similarities to the project, we can easily see a mission, what I'm calling the mission of post-beauty. Just the last quick one, I think it's the last one, is engineering form. So in Switzerland and in Germany and also in Latin America, there's a set of axes, very, very strong in Europe, where geometry relative to engineering and material becomes a subset obsession, for a few people, which did affect a larger condition in architectural discourse. So this is a way in which I would say that if this is about a certain kind of idea of sensibility and a general ethos, I would say this is a project of working on problems where the Vienna-LA axis wasn't working on a problem, and in some cases working on problems, of course, we share that together. So form-found geometry and thin-shell concrete between Isler and Candela, and of course the projects done by Otto, less in thin-shell and more in nets and cable structures, puts them into this group of engineers. I'm not showing Calatrava, can't do that. Puts them in a subset of engineer architects who, of course, were sharing lots and lots of ideas and articulated a group based around dealing with problems. Here it is. You're always somewhere with someone. And this is, I think, the key, which is A, recognize where you are. Recognize who's next to you. Recognize who's even far away from you. Go find them, because they are part of your tribe. Recognize the marginal differences or even the less marginal differences between you and your like-minded friend or colleague. When you go, yeah, dude, I like that. That's amazing. I do too. That's pretty fantastic, but it should be taken, sort of a step further, and I think that's what the goal of the year is to ask you to recognize, where you're at and who you're with, and hopefully we can do that this year. Thanks.